Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about the future of design education. Today on the show, I am joined by the furniture designer, educator, and the president of the Rhode Island School of Design, Rosanne Somerson. Rosanne actually studied industrial design at RISD and ran a successful studio for about 10 years or so before returning to the school in 1985 to teach furniture design there and eventually leading and helping to start their new furniture design program. Then in 2015, she was appointed the 17th president of RISD after serving as provost since 2012. This was a fascinating conversation for me and one that falls into a recent series on the sort of administration and leading of design institutions, which is something that I'm very interested in. So I was really excited to talk to Rosanne about her career and how she thinks about her presidency. We begin the conversation talking about her early interest in photography, actually, and how she transitioned into industrial and furniture design. We talk about how she started teaching and the influence her professional practice had on the classroom before talking about her role as president and how this unique background shapes how she thinks about this work. We also talk about design education more generally and where she sees it heading and kind of the role of design education in today's world. Over the years, I've talked to many RISD faculty and alumni on the show, so it was truly a complete honor to talk with Rosanne about her vision for the school and her unique journey to leading an institution like RISD. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. If you are a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that features behind-the-scenes content, links and articles from former guests about design and writing and criticism and practice and all the things we talk about on the show, as well as the previews of upcoming episodes. Scratching the Surface is fully supported through these memberships, so if you like the show and want to help support its ongoing production, I hope that you would consider joining. Thank you, as always, for listening and enjoy this conversation with Rosanne Somerson. You originally were interested in photography before you got into industrial design and furniture design, and I kind of want to start there. What was it about photography that interested you? And then I guess when you went to RISD, you kind of discovered industrial design and furniture design and made this shift. Then what was it that then kind of pulled you in the other direction?
So the interest in photography really stemmed from admiration for my older brother, who in high school was a photographer, and somehow through a connection that we all had summer jobs working for the Philadelphia Folk Festival.
Mm.
And my brother, I did writing and biography work, and my brother was able to do photography. And through that connection, he actually got to go to Chicago and do photography with a lot of the Chicago blues greats, Junior Wells,
Mm.
Buddy Guy, those folks
Mm-hmm.
who were printed in prints that he had in his bedroom, big poster-sized prints. And so he created this kind of ad hoc dark room in our basement and called me down one day and said, "Look at this," and put a piece of paper when there were still developing trays into
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
a tray, and this magic of this photograph came to life, and it just kind of blew me away. And I think also I had a very strong sense of visual acuity because I had grown up kind of helping to take care of my grandfather who was blind, and I sort of saw
Mm.
myself as his eyes. So I was always describing things to him and trying to create experiences that would let him experience the visual world. And so it really increased my vocabulary around understanding and explaining the visual world, and that was a very natural bridge to photography.
Yeah.
When I decided to go to RISD, it was because before I even went to RISD, I finished high school a year early. I was really ready to be done with high school, so I ended up doing 2 years of credits in one. Kind of worked really hard and got
Mm-hmm.
out, and then saw this little ad in the back of a magazine about a school for photography and creative writing in the northern reaches of Denmark. And I wrote them a letter and got in for a summer program, which I assume was going to be a summer only. And I really loved it there and ended up staying for most of the year in Denmark. And at that school, we were really learning very technical photography. We were working in large format, 4x5, 8x10,
Mm,
making all our own chemicals from things that we got at the pharmacy, and really beginning to understand the technical aspects of making prints. And from the composition side to the printing side. When I got to RISD, I applied there because at the time, Aaron Siska and Harry
mm,
Callahan were
mhm.
here, and they were very famous photographers. So I was excited about working with them. But when I got here, I actually took a course, which we have something called winter session, which you're supposed to take
Yeah.
something outside of the area that you think you'll study. And I took a woodworking class, and I just kind of fell in love with it. The challenge was so intense, and
Yeah.
I had to use parts of intelligence that I'd never used before. And I really liked the idea of making things that people could directly interact with and use. So it kind of
Mm.
shifted my focus.
I mean, that's interesting, talking about kind of wanting to make things that people could use. And what I thought was interesting about what you were just saying is that you kind of taking care of your grandfather, you saw seeing almost as it was a useful thing. It was a way to help somebody. And I was curious if you kind of saw these activities you were doing at that age as artistic, as creative, or were they function, documentary, literally
Mm.
helping someone see? You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. No, I think I was most interested in the intersection between the two. So,
Okay.
thinking about it as a visual and creative process, but with an outcome that would actually include other people. It was more about the idea of bringing people into it who didn't necessarily have the ability to make or even experience objects like that. So in a way, it probably drew off of what I was doing for my grandfather, but there was sort of a service in a weird way aspect to it,
Mm,
but not so much around function. It was more around expanding people's experience of
mm,
visual and aesthetic objects,
mhm.
but also in a way that was really pleasant to use and well designed and smart and used materials well and all of those things. But I do think that it was kind of the intersection between the creative and the not so much useful as a driving force, but more engaging, I guess.
And so you then kind of dove right into industrial design, and we can then connect this to then when you go back to RISD to teach, and you help start the furniture design program. And so at that time when you were a student, industrial design, I imagine, was not just furniture, but also products of all scales and shapes and sizes.
Yeah, I mean, I won't get into the politics at the time because
Okay.
it
Okay.
wasn't a direct path into industrial design. But I was told to go into sculpture first, and I went into
Mm,
sculpture, and I really loved my classes there, and I think did pretty well. But the head of the department said you could at the time, and I think it's changed now, but you can't make anything functional in this department.
okay.
So they said, if you want to do this, you have to move into industrial design. So I moved into industrial design
Okay.
really because I wanted to make things in wood. And um, the industrial design department at the time had a graduate program in furniture design that was run by Tay Frid, who was a kind of Danish
Mm,
master. And so there was sort of a little hidden wood graduate program within the industrial design department. There were two different master's degrees, and so I was
okay.
working alongside of those graduate students who were, teaching me a lot about technical aspects that I just hadn't had before. But I also did take all the industrial design requirements. So I took courses that also were the basis for architecture students, and we
Okay.
learned geology and sort of statistics and lots of different things. And the design work between the kind of designing and making that I learned in sculpture and the formal design background that I learned in industrial design, it was actually a really nice bridge that made sense with the work that I wanted to do.
The reason I was kind of asking that question is I was curious about um, industrial design being this kind of wide, expansive field, and you seem to really focus fairly early on furniture. And then, after you graduated, you went on to be a furniture designer with your own studio. I was kind of curious about what it was about furniture as opposed to, like kitchen gadgets or,
Mhm.
you,
More,
you know what I mean?
yeah.
Why was furniture so interesting to you?
Well, I really liked the idea of making something well that had a strong aesthetic and again a way for people to engage with it. And the craft of it was really important for me, and the material exploration. And I think, in retrospect, also at the time, it was a very male field. And I felt like,
Mm-hmm.
as a female designer, I had certain attributes to bring to the kind of ongoing dialogue within the studio furniture world that was unique, or not maybe unique, but certainly different, and that represented things that I cared about. And so I felt that there was a lot for me to say in that world. I was also interested in the design work that we did in industrial design, but at the time, industrial design was very product based and
Right.
not so much service or systems based as it is now. And I was less interested in putting a lot of plastic or manufactured
Hmm.
things in the world. I was really more concerned with putting
I see.
objects that had that human commitment in the making, and then the recipient. It was sort of a conversation between the designer maker and the person who got to enjoy it on the other end, and that really fascinated me, that dialogue.
So was your practice primarily early on? I mean, I guess kind of as it's continued, less about. Um, I don't mean to set these as opposite or sound like I'm making a value judgment between
Mhm.
them, but less about mass produced things, and you were kind of working with people to create some sort of bespoke or unique thing for a client.
A lot of my practice was, but the majority of my
Okay.
practice was one of a kind objects for
Oh, interesting.
exhibitions or for clients. And I did do some limited editions, some small batch production runs, but even within that, there was often variation. And only later in my career did I start to do some more mass produced items that were actually built by external factories. But for me, the control and the kind of quality and commitment of the workmanship, or and the use of really special materials,
Yeah.
just required a kind of different cost structure, because a piece could take 6 months to make. So it was definitely more of a kind of bespoke at the beginning anyway, and through most of the
Yeah.
early career, more of a gallery kind of process than a factory or store outlet kind of process.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I mean, I just like am embarrassed that I just assumed, and I had looked at your work, and I just assumed that, as a someone who studied industrial design and furniture design, that these pieces were kind of the intention was mass production. So I find it so fascinating, that I just kind of had never even thought about it the other way. It's
Well,
kind of
it's not a field,
embarrassing.
yeah, it's not a field that has great support anymore because things have changed. But at the time,
Yeah.
it was also, kind of a feminist statement, that because I would
Mm-hmm.
put things in shows and people would say, "Who made this for you?" Or I'd go to get materials and people would say, "Lady, what are you trying to do?" And so I really felt like
Right.
I had an obligation to, which has actually proved very important for a whole new generation of women who feel empowered to work in materials and processes that at the time were, I was kind of a phenomenon. There were a small group
Right.
of us. It wasn't just me, but it was really not common to have women making things at the level of extreme craftsmanship and technical sort of
Mm-hmm.
finesse that I was putting into my work. And so it really had an impact on changing the field and opening it up. I think men at the time who were working were much more interested in kind of demonstrating their technical
Mm.
capabilities. And I think women were bringing in more of a narrative and more of a different kind of series, all in our own ways, different kinds of factors that really expanded the field.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more because you worked, you ran this studio, and then like 10 years after you finished at RISD, you go back to teach. And was that part of the kind of desire to teach, or what was it about teaching that interested you? Was it kind of talking about these ideas with other people?
I was asked to come back and teach by my former teacher, and
Mm,
I really felt that honored in a way that he asked me. He asked me if I would come in because he was thinking about retiring and run his graduate program. And
mm.
I didn't have a master's degree at the time because there weren't really a lot of strong programs that I
Yeah.
wanted to go to in my field. And I interviewed with the dean, who was an architect, and I said, why would you hire me? I don't even have a master's degree. And he said, well, you have the professional equivalent. And then he pointed out to me that my teacher
Mm.
didn't even have a college degree. So I
Oh, interesting.
yeah, when I came in, I rewrote and rebuilt an entire graduate degree. And I think I was fascinated because I felt really fortunate that I had opportunities that weren't widely available. And I really felt like my approach to teaching was not so much to take information and transfer it from one to another, but
Hmm.
really to open up doors for other people to find their own way of working. And I found that I was, okay at it. And it became really rewarding. And I added it up at one point. I think I've taught over 600 students in my teaching career, and
Oh, wow.
I'm still in touch with a majority of them. I mean, I know you've interviewed some of them, but they are,
Yeah.
it's a kind of, in a way, privilege to work with all of these talented individuals and watch them grow their own careers. So it's very rewarding work.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before we started recording, I just interviewed Josh Owen last week, and I didn't tell him that I was going to be interviewing you, and he mentioned the influence of your teaching on his practice,
Mm.
um, and so I think you're right. I think it did kind of have a profound impact on people. Did you have any interest in teaching before you got that call? Was that something you thought I might like to do this, or I could be good at this?
Well, in a little way, when I was in in middle school, I volunteered to teach reading to kids who did
Mm,
not have literacy. And I really
hmm.
found that very rewarding. It was challenging, but I really liked it. And then when I was still in my studio full time, which was going really well, and it was a real decision: do I want to leave this? Because
Yeah.
studio work was sustaining me, and I was building my studio. But I got asked to do a 2 week favor for a public school system in Boston, where I was living at the time. To be a substitute for somebody that had been busted for drugs or something. And so I agreed to do it for 2 weeks, and then the 2 weeks turned into a full year of teaching kindergarten through eighth grade woodworking, sheet metal, and mechanical drawing, which was very interesting at
Mm,
the kindergarten level. But
yeah.
I they wanted me to stay on, and I just said, no, this really isn't my I want to go back to my studio. And then just at that time, RISD called, and I thought, well, if I'm going to teach, let me teach graduate students at RISD. That's much more in keeping with where my work is
Yeah.
going than teaching. As much as I loved the kids, my life calling was not teaching sheet metal to second graders. So, uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so that it was just kind of fortuitous timing, I would say. And I was teaching part-time at first so that I was able to really do both.
That's exactly what my next question was
Mhm.
going to be. I was wondering about that kind of intersection or the relationship between the studio work, and especially when the dean says, you have this professional practical experience. How was that filtering in to the teaching work, and then vice versa? Was teaching then having an influence on how you were thinking about your own work?
Yeah, I mean, it's inevitable that they would have cross influence. I think I was fortunate to be sort of moving fast forward in a field that was developing fast. At the time, there was lots of interest in collecting the kind of work that I was making, and shows were doing very well, and opportunities were increasing, and I love sharing all that professional information with my students, many of whom wanted to do what I was doing. Some, wanted to do something entirely different, but I think at RISD, all of the faculty have to be involved in professional practice in their fields.
Right.
So for me, it was very exciting to be able to kind of mentor at the same time as teach. And, I think in terms of the return on my own building of ideas, I had to do a lot of reading and
Mhm.
kind of exposing myself to different histories and different things so that I could teach well. And that certainly allowed me to expand my own thinking and my work. I wouldn't say that I directly got ideas for work from my students, but I think it was
Right.
more in the preparation for guiding them that I also was expanding my own knowledge base.
Right. And that's kind of, yeah, that's kind of why I was asking, because I'm a fairly new teacher. I've been teaching adjunct at schools here in New York, where I live again,
Mhm.
for the last 5 years or so, and have found that being in the classroom again has kind of reignited what got me excited about design when I was their age.
It's great. Yeah.
And that excitement has then come back into the work that I do as a designer. And I haven't fully thought through what it is about the classroom that generates that excitement in me. And so I was kind of curious for you, as someone who is also doing both kind of practice and teaching, if you saw kind of relationships or crossover there.
Yeah, I think two things that come to mind. One is that, my approach to teaching was so much about establishing your own personal approach and voice, and,
Hmm.
and building that so that it wouldn't have made sense for me to see something that would sort of ricochet back to me in a direct way. But,
Right, right.
I think that the getting into the minds of all different ways of thinking certainly helped make me more flexible as a designer.
Mm,
The
mhm.
other thing that I would say, which was a complete uh, cheap shot in a way, was that I would do this one assignment with students that was about music, and it's a long, complicated thing, but it was about making a form that sort of represented a kind of piece of music for someone that was very unfamiliar with the music. There was a lot more to it than that, but the
Huh,
whole purpose
okay.
of it was for me to learn about contemporary music from what my students were listening to, because I didn't know contemporary music through each, decade. So I
Yeah,
was finding out like what was the greatest stuff that students were listening to, and so that was a
right.
direct gain. But it was also, in a way, a symbolic statement about really keeping in touch with what was at the edge of culture for each generation. And so
Right.
from a design perspective, that was very valuable to learn because, they're thick in it. And partly why they wanted to learn from me was that I had a longer sense of history and evolution. Partly what I could learn from them was what was the newest, latest, greatest thing. And so that was a
Yeah.
beneficial, relationship.
Yeah, I wanna talk more about what you were saying about kind of your pedagogical approach was to hone in on students' individual voices, and you had mentioned earlier that you were very interested in, the narrative and the story around the work as opposed to just the craftsmanship, which is
Mhm.
kind of how it was taught or thought about at the time. And I was first aware of you from the book The Art of Critical Making that you
Mhm.
published when you were provost, which I think is tapping into all of these ideas. Now,
Mhm.
kind of hearing you talk about um, your own approach and journey, and I'm kind of curious how do you think about the intersection of narrative, voice, kind of expression with things like craftsmanship, the technical skills. How do those things start to kind of interact and talk to each other in the classroom? Or how do you kind of hit on both of those?
So I think in part there's this. I think that good design brings those things together, and
Hmm.
certainly,
Hmm.
good
Hmm.
design that involves making or even specifying for production really is about having a cultural um, anchor in a way or position.
Hmm.
And that part of it has gotten even more important now as we're really understanding the assumptions and biases that are built into history and the decorative arts
Yeah.
and the art history, et cetera, and really untangling those and making space for new voices to be leading voices.
Hmm.
It's actually something I think more relevant now, even than then when I started teaching. But it was that sense of, I was always really proud when someone said that they couldn't tell from someone's work that they had studied with me, because I was not interested in
Mm.
replicating. And I could see in other programs, you could really tell who someone had studied with. And
Yeah.
I think that's kind of in a way, again, well, it's certainly something that a lot of faculty here at RISD are also very proud of, that they are helping to educate really independent thinkers who have their own aesthetics and points of view. And that to me is how the fields evolve. But within that, I believe that has to be an intentionality about making. It's not that everyone has to, be an extreme crafts crazy person and, make things that are impossible to make, but they have to make things that have techniques that are in alignment with their philosophical approach. And so
Right.
understanding what those decisions were based on, I used to often say to students who were rejecting the kind of tediousness of learning certain things, show me that you can do it once and then you can break all the rules. But I just need to
Right.
know that you understand the principles of the rules that you're breaking.
Yeah.
And then I was really encouraging about pushing the boundaries outside of the kind of history. But I really felt that there was a baseline language that made a more rigorous thinker once your hands and your brain had that intelligence together.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that 100%. I love what you said about, kind of telling your students, I want to see that you understand the rules before you break them. I gave a typography assignment. I'm teaching an intro to typography class this
Mm-hmm.
semester, and I gave a typography assignment that was um, very strict. And my kind of approach is like you in that I don't want people to try to be like me, or
Mm-hmm.
I don't want their work to look like me. And I said literally that exact same thing in class just yesterday. I just need to see that you know the rules before you can kind of
Yeah.
push this further. So yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Now, students
Um,
today would probably say, well, who sets the rules? I mean,
right.
it's a really interesting moment because the rules are based on certain principles that a lot of students are pushing up against. And I really admire that. So those become really fruitful places for dialogue. But I
Yeah.
want to make sure that the intention when someone is taking that approach is not because they're avoiding learning something, but rather because they have something else to propose.
Right, right, exactly. And I think you're exactly right about, well, where do these rules come from? And that's something that even I, as the teacher, am kind of pushing up against. And it's like, well, okay, what of these rules do they actually, or, and I'm saying rules with quotes around it.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, what of these do I actually need to kind of teach them? And which, some of these, maybe it's okay to throw these out now, which I
Hmm.
find of kind of very uh, interesting thing, which I think, again, to bring it back to the book on critical making, is one of the ideas there, is that this is not just um, mindless making. This is not just kind of making things that look nice, but that there is a criticality and an inquiry
Absolutely.
around it, which sounds like it's rooted in both your own work and then also teaching. And then I imagine now as president, kind of the way you are directing the institution.
Absolutely.
And something else about the book that I was thinking about, I reread. I actually got the book when I was in grad school, um, because I was interested in design criticism and the intersection with practice. And I got a lot out of it, but I reread your introduction to prepare for this
Hmm.
again. And a thread that I hadn't picked up throughout the book that I was noticing this time is this idea that art and design education is important not just for art and artists and designers, but that this mode of inquiry and these ideas of critical making actually apply to the world at large. And so you mentioned a lawyer who studied at RISD, or someone who owns a restaurant. And what struck me in reading it is that now you are kind of one of those people who who comes from a very rigorous design background and has a job that probably most of us wouldn't consider a design job.
Hmm.
And I'm curious how you think about that. Do you you know how do you think about your job now, and then this career that you've had, how that is influencing that approach?
Well, actually, from the way that I'm approaching it is very much as a design job, in the sense
Okay.
that higher education is in an unsustainable pattern right now. And
Mm-hmm.
we have such big ambitions for things that we want to achieve, but the financial model is not a sustainable model.
Yeah.
So there are so many challenges that require incredible ingenuity to figure out how to advance something in a way that makes big impact in the world and still works
Mm.
structurally. So, in a way, it's like people said to me when I started being president, do you feel bad because you're giving up your studio practice? And I said, no, I'm just applying all that thinking to an opportunity to reinvent design education, in a way that's appropriate for RISD, or art and design education, in a way that's
Right.
appropriate for RISD. And I still do have a commitment to myself that I make one piece every year. So I still have,
Okay. I was going to ask if you still have a studio
I
practice.
do.
Okay.
And, it's not as productive in terms of the number of pieces I'm making, but I'm still advancing my thinking in my studio and still exhibiting work. I'm in a show right
Mm.
now, and I just finished a piece that will be traveling in a museum show next year. And so that's important to me because it keeps, it's like, when you're working out, you need to keep some sort of
Hmm.
baseline of
Hmm.
exercise, right? But I also feel the incredible privilege of being in a situation where I'm in a school like RISD with the faculty and students here who are so extraordinary and helping to think about what the next generations of students need. I mean, I feel very fortunate in the career that I've had. It's been incredibly rewarding, and I've met amazing people and made some of the most dear friendships ever. And
Hmm.
learned an enormous amount about myself along the way. But I want to create those conditions now for the next generation of students that are facing a very different world. So, again, maybe it goes back to the beginning of this conversation where there's always this sense of making something,
Hmm.
for the other to experience or engage in. I feel very much that way about leading a school like RISD as I did about why I went from photography to furniture. Um,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I will say, I just want to put a disclaimer in here that I still love photography, and actually I'm using it now in my furniture in a new way.
Oh,
But for
interesting.
me, there was that sense, and also I think photography, and certainly here, and in the contemporary art world, it can be very three dimensional in nature. There are people using photography in ways that weren't in my thinking, in the '70s when I was a student. But there is something about the stance of an object capturing its own identity within a space that was really important to me. And one could perhaps argue that the same thing could be said about a school
Mm.
commanding a kind of position in the larger world of education.
I'm sorry, this is probably a boring question, but I find it interesting that you're saying that you are approaching this job as a designer, and it totally makes sense. But I think for context, I, I'm embarrassed to ask this question. Can you talk a little bit about what is involved in being the president of RISD? Like, what does your day look like? What kind of things are you actually doing?
Yeah. Well, it's not an embarrassing question. It's
Okay.
every day here is
Thank you.
different. I mean, there is kind of a rhythm that runs through because there's an academic calendar. So, there are certain
Hmm.
kinds of flows that happen. But we just launched a strategic plan that's going to be our map for the
Hmm.
next 7 years, and so there's so many parts to being a president, from really thinking about engaging with all of our communities and different constituencies, from applicants to alumni, all the way in between, boards, faculty, students, staff. There's a lot of just management work of making sure that we're using all of our resources well, that we're hiring well, that we're mapping our all of our processes to our values, which is very important to me. So
Mm.
we established a set of values that include principles around inclusion, and also the kind of that really suit our particular population of students, which is not necessarily a mainstream entirely population. So making sure that all the processes that we use in the school map our values, making sure our communications echo the principles that we're representing in the institution. And then there's lots of travel, kind of beyond even just specifically RISD, spreading the word about art and design and
Mm.
its importance as a form of education right now. So I do a lot of public speaking and writing, and participation in panels and juries, to bring that message out into the world. And I believe that I've really been able to convince communities that don't necessarily understand the full value of what we do to really
Yeah.
respect our kind of education in a new way. And then there's a lot of fundraising. We have huge needs for one of my first priorities as president was to create a platform around equity and inclusion. And that means figuring out ways to not just get the best students to RISD, but the ones who can't afford to be here, to get them to actually show up and be able to succeed here. And then there's a whole process beyond just getting students here to supporting them to succeed. So there are lots of different aspects of being a president, and it's really it's incredibly challenging because it's 24/7. You're always
Yeah.
working, and
Yeah.
but it's also just watching the changes that we've been able to make, and the ambitions of the new programs and degrees and facilities and connections with different audiences that we've been able to put into place. It's a hugely exciting time for to be in this role.
Yeah, and it's interesting to go back to the earlier part of the conversation, talking about that kind of balance or intersection of the narrative and the story and the voice with the craftsmanship and the technical skills. And even the way you talked about your job now, there's that balance. There's the what do we stand for? What do we want to do? Who are we? And then there's also fundraising
Yeah,
and balancing budgets. And like
exactly.
that's the technical side. That's really interesting.
But they again say they really inform each other, because fundraising is not just about getting money; it's about getting people engaged and believing in what we do. And the
Mm.
stories that we tell are really the way that people want to participate. It's not so much that we can lay out a business model and say, here's the the term sheet. This is what we need to achieve financially. It's more like, let me tell you about this student who is a DACA student who lived
Mm.
in
Hmm.
foster homes his whole life and came here and now is doing X or Y. Because of his education here. And he got here because somebody was a mentor in one of his schools who believed in him and helped him to find out about a place like this. I mean, these stories are so enthralling when they're about the people who have succeeded or about the projects. I mean, we have students working in projects that are helping with understanding, living with disabilities or different abilities in ways that really bring in whole populations into the realm of design that haven't had advocacy before, or incredible work around sustainability and climate change and habitats and all of these things that are making direct positive impact in the world at a time when there's a lot of cynicism and fear in the world. And so
Yeah.
we can be that leading voice that helps people want to participate in making the world a better place.
I wanted to dig in a little bit more on design education and kind of where that's headed. And um, I had read another interview that you had done where you talked about kind of talking about the importance of design education because a lot of students today are basically being taught for jobs that no longer
Hmm.
exist. And it reminded me of something one of my advisors in grad school said to me when I started teaching, in that she sees her job as a design professor to not train students to get a job right after they graduate, but to train students for the job that they're going to get 10 years from
Yeah,
now. Um, because it's going to be completely different. I think about my own career and like the 10 years that I've been working, and how many jobs there are that didn't exist when I was, how many design jobs there were, and then how many things I learned in school that are just irrelevant
exactly.
now.
Yeah.
Uh, and even like you mentioned earlier about product
Hmm.
design and the way that term has been co-opted by Silicon Valley
Hmm.
of a digital designer is now a product designer. Can you talk about that kind of that pace of change and how design education can both kind of prepare students for that, but then also, keep up with it or even get out in front of it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of dance between keeping up with it and getting out in front of it. But I think what makes it work is having a core kind of understanding about applying what you're learning into new contexts. And, to me, that's a real education when you can translate
Mm-hmm.
ideas into new contexts. And, the every industry is changing so rapidly. So the people who are going to succeed are those who can navigate that change with authority, that have the
Right.
ability to take
Right.
what they know from one instance and put it into another. And also, I think individuals who can share bodies of knowledge with others. And I think artists and designers are incredibly good at convening conversations around
Mm-hmm.
developing ideas so that a lot of new knowledge is coming out of engineering and art or design together, or coming out of technology areas
Mm-hmm.
that are really made that are made sense of by artists and designers. So that it's those intersections that we really can foster in a way that I think someone with a more traditional kind of education may not have the versatility to navigate. So that's what I think
Mm.
is so powerful about art and design education right now. If you just think about it in the simplest sense of an artist facing an absolute blank piece of paper and creating
Mm-hmm.
something that's never existed before. And in a metaphorical way, that's what artists and designers are doing every day. And it's what the world is expecting for successful competencies, moving into the future.
You've been in this role for a couple years now, and I imagine, I don't want to say that you're settling into it, but you have those rhythms down. It is that challenge. It is 24/7. What are you thinking about now, or now that you've kind of been in this job for a while? What are the new challenges that are coming up for you in this job?
Well, there's always this issue of access to education. That's a huge
Mm-hmm.
commitment of mine. And I've been able to hire an incredible team. We have an unbelievable leadership team now that's working super well together so that I think we
Mm.
can take on more challenges. But some of the things that are pillars for what we're focusing on now are around issues of sustainability and climate change and what we can do
Mm.
uniquely to help both mitigate and but also design for the inevitable things that are challenges moving forward. And another big area that we're working on is something we call just societies, and it's about looking at populations across the globe and figuring out how to improve lives within those populations, whether it's in urban
Mm.
environments or
Mm-hmm.
rural environments. But what I'm really excited about is that we're developing a platform around the intersectional space between sustainability and just societies, because It's very well
Mm.
documented that populations that will be dealing with climate challenges at the greatest degree of challenge are not, the wealthy populations.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we have such a um, committed group of students here who no longer necessarily want to become the sort of famous artist or famous designer. They're more interested in
Hmm.
using their talents to make positive impact in the world, and our faculty are very much encouraging that. So there's that aspect. I think there's also the aspect of thinking about how technology is employed in every discipline that is practiced here, and thinking
Mm,
about the
mm,
new ways
hmm.
that technology will morph under human control. There's this incredibly frightening thing today in the newspaper about this quantum computing that's been something,
Oh yeah.
is going to
Yeah.
potentially change everything, right? And no more encryption
Yeah.
and, vast volumes of information processing. How do we deal with that? How does the public deal with that? And, artists and
Yeah.
designers,
Yeah.
have a relationship with technology that can be very insightful about communicating how we make sense of all of this. So as we become, we're very lucky. All of our numbers are really solid in terms of our enrollment's gone up, our applications have gotten far more selective.
Mm,
We've hired 40% of the full-time faculty since I've been president have come to the institution in that time. We've had
mm. Oh
the
wow.
biggest fundraising years we've ever had. So the numbers are going well, which means, from my style of leading an institution, that it's time to set the ambitions even further out. We're in a really solid
Yeah.
position to do
Yeah.
that. And so the strategic plan was not a result of my vision alone. It was a community effort that included, all of our communities, parents, alumni, students, staff, faculty, etc., so that we feel like as an institution we're making a commitment to taking the wonderful aspects of what we teach here and what our alumni and faculty practice here and make it have genuine impact in the world in a positive way.
My last question, this is a question that I used to end all of these conversations, and you mentioned earlier that when you started teaching, you found yourself reading a lot, or kind of building up the kind of graduate program that you didn't have. I'm curious what you're reading now. Are you kind of in a similar mode? What are you reading at the
I'm
moment?
in the middle of 35 books. I'm
I love
I'm
that.
reading. I mean, for pleasure right now on planes, I'm reading a book called The Overstory, which is about different kind of fables
Oh,
about trees, which is really fascinating. But
I've heard of
yeah,
this.
it's a really interesting book, and it's very kind of good because you can read a chapter here and there. But I've been reading a number of authors from different regions of the world. I've been reading a lot of African
Mm.
authors. I do also read a lot of information about trends and technology and
Mhm.
design and changes and all of that. But for pleasure, I really like reading fictional narratives from different regions of the world, and also things that connect to the natural world. I spend a lot of time when
Mm.
I have any time off. I like to spend it either hiking or on the water, rowing or biking, or somewhere out in the natural world. And so I'm tending to, since I can't always be there, read things that take me there.
Yeah, I love that. Amazon keeps recommending the Overstory to me. It's like the top recommendation for me on Amazon all the time. And so now hearing you say this, I feel like I have to just
Yeah,
buy it.
no, it's really good. And I'll also put a pitch in for another book that I read recently that, full disclosure, my sister-in-law wrote, but it's called Slipper.
Okay.
And it's a really interesting kind of
Okay.
dark take on the Cinderella story that I think is a really interesting book for particularly women to read. And it's just so well written.
Mm.
So it's very visual writing. And I love writers who
Oh
use
yeah.
language to produce really a visual experience.
Oh, I love that. That's such a nice way to wrap up this conversation, too. Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed this. I feel like I learned a lot. I think you're doing great work. Thank you for being on the
Thanks so
podcast.
much, Jarrett. Nice speaking with you.
This episode was recorded on October 23rd, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.